There are walls that divide cities, and then there are walls that divide blood. In Herzogenaurach, a small Bavarian town where church bells still mark the hours and cobblestone streets remember centuries, one property line became something else entirely, not a legal boundary, a declaration of war. The residence that Adi Dassler built on one side of the river was never just a house. It was a position, a statement. And across the water, his brother Rudolf watched from his own estate, close enough to see the lights at night, far enough that they would never speak again. If you value stories that examine how ambition reshapes families and transforms private homes into battlegrounds, consider subscribing. We're building a community of 1,000 who appreciate architecture that carries the weight of what happened inside it. The split happened in 1948. The official records are clean, procedural. Two brothers dissolving a shared business. A factory divided. Assets separated, each taking half. But in Herzogenaurach, nothing was ever that simple. When Adi chose his plot of land for the new residence, he chose it with precision. High ground, clear sight lines across the Aurach River. A house positioned not just for living, but for watching. Rudolf, in turn, built close enough that the message was clear. Neither would retreat. The town itself became the chessboard. Families chose sides. Pubs refused to serve those who wore the wrong shoes. Children crossed the street to avoid classmates whose fathers worked for the enemy. The Dassler home was never palatial in the manner of American estates or French chateaux. This was Bavaria. Restraint mattered. But the house Adi built after the war carried a different kind of weight. Solid, precise, every angle calculated. The kind of structure that announces permanence. 3 stories of clean lines and windows that faced the factory he now controlled alone. Inside, the furniture was comfortable, but never extravagant. Adi did not collect art. He collected prototypes. Shoe designs lined the walls of his study like trophies. Each one a small victory in the war he waged daily against his brother's competing empire across town. What the house revealed most clearly was not wealth, but control. Adi ran his business from a desk positioned to overlook both the factory floor and the river beyond. From that window, on clear days, he could see the roofline of Rudolf's Puma headquarters. The distance was less than 2 kilometers. The silence between them, absolute. The war, the real war, the one that devastated Germany, had ended 3 years before the brothers formalized their separation. But in Herzogenaurach, a different conflict was just beginning, one with no treaties, no armistice. Adi's residence became the headquarters of his half of the divided legacy. Not a mansion in the traditional sense, but a command center, a place where strategy was drawn, not just for shoe manufacturing, but for the systematic erasure of a brother from family memory. Visitors to the Dassler home noted the quiet. Adi was not a man who raised his voice. He spoke softly, with the careful diction of someone who had learned that every word carried consequence. His wife, Kate, managed the household with the same efficiency Adi applied to production lines. Dinner was served at precisely 6:30. Business associates were received in the ground floor study. Family remained upstairs. The structure of the house mirrored the structure of Adi's mind, compartmentalized, functional, impenetrable. But beneath the order, a question lingered in every room, unspoken but always present. Can success survive when loyalty inside the home is broken? The Dassler family did not begin with mansions or empires. They began with leather and thread. Adolf Dassler, Adi, was born in 1900 in a house that smelled of shoe polish and sweat. His father ran a small laundry. His mother baked bread to supplement the income. Herzogenaurach was a town of cobblers and craftsmen, a place where ambition was measured in the quality of stitching, not the scale of production. Adi learned to make shoes in his mother's kitchen, cutting patterns on the same table where the family ate. His older brother Rudolf returned from the First War with a salesman's instinct and a soldier's discipline. Together, they saw an opening. Germany in the 1920s was broken in ways that statistics could not capture. Inflation devoured savings overnight. Veterans wandered streets looking for purpose. But people still needed shoes. And athletes, the new heroes of a humiliated nation, seeking redemption through sport, needed something better than what cobblers were making in back rooms. Adi understood this instinctively. He was not interested in dress shoes or work boots. He wanted to build what had never existed, footwear engineered for speed. The brothers formalized their partnership in 1924, Gebrüder Dassler Schuhfabrik, Dassler Brothers Shoe Factory. The name carried weight in the family, a declaration that they would rise together. Rudolf handled sales and contracts. Adi disappeared into his workshop, obsessed with mechanics, how leather flexed, how spikes gripped track surfaces, how a single gram of excess weight could cost a runner a fraction of a second. He was not a scientist. He had no formal engineering training, but he possessed the most dangerous kind of intelligence, practical obsession married to technical intuition. The house where they began was modest, attached to the workshop. Adi married Käthe in 1934. Rudolf married Friedel. The couples lived in proximity that would later seem unimaginable. Shared meals, shared business decisions. The children played together in courtyards that smelled of rubber and leather. The brothers worked 17-hour days, side by side, building something that was beginning to matter beyond Herzogenaurach. Then came 1936, the Berlin Olympics. Jesse Owens wore Dassler spikes when he shattered Adolf Hitler's racial mythology in front of the world. 4 gold medals. And on his feet, shoes hand-delivered by Adi Dassler, who had traveled to the Olympic Village himself, kneeling before the American champion to ensure the fit was perfect. It was not a political statement. Adi did not think in those terms. It was technical, practical. The best athlete in the world needed the best shoes. Everything else was noise. The orders poured in after Berlin. The factory expanded. The brothers hired workers. Money for the first time was not the primary constraint, but success created new tensions. Rudolf wanted to leverage their Olympic triumph, to build a brand that transcended sport. Adi wanted to disappear deeper into his workshop, to refine, to perfect. They were no longer just brothers running a family business. They were partners with diverging visions, bound together by blood and balance sheets. The war came, and with it, compromises that would poison everything that followed. Both brothers joined the Nazi Party, not out of conviction according to later accounts, but out of necessity. The contracts they needed, the materials they required, everything flowed through party channels. Adi received a deferment to keep the factory running. Rudolf was conscripted, then released, then conscripted again. The years between 1939 and 1945 were a blur of contradictions. The factory produced boots for the Wehrmacht. Adi continued making track spikes in stolen hours. The brothers' wives managed operations when the men were absent. Survival was not glorious. It was transactional. When the Americans arrived in Herzogenaurach in April 1945, they found a town that had avoided the worst of the bombing, but carried the stain of complicity like everyone else. The Dassler factory was repurposed temporarily to produce training shoes for American troops. Denazification proceedings began. Both brothers faced questioning, and somewhere in the testimony, in the sealed rooms where the past was being catalogued and judged, a fracture opened. Rudolf believed Adi had testified against him to protect the business. Adi believed Rudolf had endangered them both with reckless associations. The exact words exchanged were never recorded. What mattered was that trust, once broken in those rooms, could not be repaired with apologies or explanations. The accusations might have been misunderstandings, but misunderstandings in families often cut deeper than truth. By 1947, the silence between them had calcified into something structural. They still shared the factory, still shared the family name above the door, but they no longer spoke except through intermediaries. Friedel and Käthe stopped visiting each other. The children were forbidden from playing together. The question was no longer whether the partnership would end, but how the empire they had built together could be divided without destroying both of them in the process. Can success survive when loyalty inside the home is broken? In 1948, they had their answer. It could not. The division was executed with surgical precision. Lawyers drafted documents. Assets were inventoried. The factory's machinery was counted, weighed, assigned. Even the employee roster was split down the middle, each brother taking half the workforce. Workers were forced to choose. There was no neutrality. If you made shoes with Adi, you did not speak to those who worked for Rudolf, and vice versa. Herzogenaurach became two towns occupying the same geography. Adi took the name that would become Adidas, a contraction of his own name, Adi Dassler. Rudolf, in a mirrored act of ego and branding, created Puma from Ruda, his nickname. The symmetry was not accidental. Each brother built his new empire as a direct answer to the other. Every design decision, every athlete sponsored, every marketing campaign. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything was warfare by other means. The residence Adi built in the early 1950s was not a palace, but it was intentional. 3 stories of Bavarian stone and timber, positioned on elevated land with clear views of the factory complex below and the river that divided the town. The architecture was modern for its time, but restrained. Large windows to flood the interior with light. Clean lines that suggested efficiency rather than excess. No ornamentation, no unnecessary curves. The house was a physical manifestation of Adi's philosophy. Form follows function. The ground floor contained the public spaces. A sitting room where business associates were received. A dining room with a table that could seat 12, though it rarely did. Adi was not a man who entertained casually. Meals were scheduled. Conversations had agendas. The study, however, was where Adi spent most of his waking hours when not in the factory. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with prototypes. Technical drawings pinned to corkboards. A desk positioned at the window, angled so that he could see both the production facility and the distant outline of Puma's headquarters across the river. Käthe managed the domestic machinery with the same quiet efficiency she brought to the business. She had been more than a wife during the war years. She had been a partner, managing operations when the men were absent, making decisions that kept the factory alive. Now, in the new order, her role was more constrained, but no less critical. She ensured the household ran without friction, that Adi's workspace remained undisturbed, that the children understood, without explicit instruction, that their father's work was sacred. The upper floors were family territory, bedrooms for the children, Horst, Inge, Karin, Brigitte, and Sigrid. Bathrooms tiled in white ceramic, hallways that smelled of furniture polish and fresh laundry. It was comfortable without being lavish. The Dasslers lived well, but they did not flaunt wealth in the manner of industrialists in Munich or Berlin. Adi's fortune was measured in market share and athlete endorsements, not in chandeliers or imported marble. Outside, the grounds were modest. A garden that Käthe tended when time allowed. A driveway that could accommodate the black Mercedes Adi drove to the factory each morning at 6:15. A boundary wall that marked property lines with the same precision Adi applied to shoe manufacturing. The house was not designed to impress visitors. It was designed to function as the command center of an expanding empire. By 1954, that empire was beginning to show results. The World Cup in Switzerland. West Germany's national team wore Adidas boots with revolutionary screw-in studs that Adi had designed specifically for wet conditions. Germany defeated Hungary in the final, a match played in driving rain that turned the pitch into mud. The Hungarian team, favoured to win, slipped and struggled in traditional fixed studs. The Germans, wearing Adi's innovation, found traction where their opponents found only frustration. The miracle of Bern, they called it. But Adi knew there was no miracle, only engineering. The orders flooded in, not just from Germany, but from across Europe, from South America, from nations building their own football dreams on the foundation of West Germany's resurrection. Adi expanded the factory, hired more workers, installed new machinery. The three stripes, his signature design element, began appearing on tracks and fields worldwide. And across the river, Rudolf watched it all happen, building Puma in furious parallel, signing his own athletes, designing his own innovations, matching Adi stride for stride in a race that would never have a finish line. The house, during these boom years, remained curiously quiet. Adi did not celebrate victories with parties. He did not host galas or invite politicians to dine. Success for him was not a moment to be marked with champagne and speeches. It was a launchpad for the next innovation, the next market, the next athlete who needed better equipment. Visitors who came to the residence on business noted the absence of luxury. No grand entrance hall, no servants in formal dress. Käthe answered the door herself more often than not. The meals served were Bavarian staples: pork, potatoes, bread. Adi drank beer in moderation and coffee in excess. The only indulgence visible in the house was the ever-expanding collection of shoes displayed in glass cases throughout his study. Not as decoration, but as a timeline of problems solved. But beneath the surface calm, the pressure was constant. The rivalry with Rudolf consumed more than business strategy. It consumed family holidays, because there could be no gatherings where both brothers were present. It consumed friendships, because Herzogenaurach had divided into Adidas streets and Puma streets, Adidas pubs and Puma pubs. It consumed the children's educations, their social circles, their understanding of what family meant. Adi's son Horst was being groomed, even in childhood, to understand that the business was everything. That loyalty to Adidas meant distance from half the family tree. That the name Dassler carried both pride and obligation in equal measure. Can success survive when loyalty inside the home is broken? The answer in the 1950s seemed to be yes. Both companies thrived. Both brothers grew wealthier. But the cost was accumulating in ways that balance sheets could not measure. In a town that had once been unified, now fractured permanently. In children who grew up knowing their cousins only as strangers. In a silence that deepened with each passing year, until it became the permanent architecture of the family itself. The 1960s brought global dominance. 75% of all Olympic track and field athletes wore Adidas spikes. The three stripes became synonymous with performance across sports: football, tennis, boxing, basketball. Adi's innovations were no longer confined to Germany or Europe. They defined what athletic footwear meant on every continent. The factory in Herzogenaurach expanded to employ over 3,000 workers. Production lines ran 24 hours. Shipping containers left Bavaria bound for stadiums in Tokyo, Mexico City, Montreal. The residence, however, remained unchanged. Adi saw no reason to build something larger or more ostentatious. The house served its purpose. It provided shelter, workspace, proximity to the factory. Moving would have been inefficient, and efficiency was the only luxury Adi truly valued. His daily routine was rigid. Wake at 5:30. Coffee at the kitchen table with Käthe, who had already been awake for an hour preparing the household. At 6:15, the short drive to the factory, where he walked the production floor before most workers arrived. He knew the machinery intimately, could diagnose problems by sound alone. a rhythmic clicking that signaled a misaligned die press, a slight hesitation in the conveyor system that meant lubrication was needed. The workers learned to recognize his footsteps. When Adi was on the floor, conversation stopped, not from fear, but from focus. He demanded precision because he embodied it. By 9, he returned to the residence for a breakfast meeting. Business partners, athletes, designers. The dining room became an extension of the boardroom. Contracts signed over soft-boiled eggs and dark bread. Prototypes examined between sips of coffee. Adi spoke little during these meetings. He listened, observed, made decisions without need for discussion or consensus. There was no democracy in his empire. There was vision, and there was execution. Keita managed the household staff, a housekeeper, a cook, a gardener, with the same philosophy Adi applied to the factory. Clear expectations, no wasted motion. The children, now teenagers and young adults, were expected to understand that the family business was not simply their father's work. It was their inheritance, their obligation. Horst, the eldest son, was already being integrated into operations. Adi did not believe in formal training programs or gradual transitions. You learned by proximity, by watching, by absorbing through osmosis the principles that could not be taught in classrooms. But Horst was not Adi. He had ideas about marketing, about branding, about leveraging celebrity endorsements in ways his father found distasteful. Adi believed the product spoke for itself. Superior engineering did not require advertising theatrics. Horst saw a changing world where image mattered as much as performance. The tension between them was polite, contained within the walls of the study, but it was there. A generational divide opening slowly, like a crack in foundation that appears harmless until the weight shifts. The house itself bore witness to Adi's singular obsession. His study expanded to occupy what had been a guest room, more shelves for prototypes, more filing cabinets for technical drawings. His collection of shoes grew to include not just Adidas designs, but competitors' products dissected and analyzed. Puma shoes sat on his desk like autopsy subjects. Adi would examine Rudolph's latest innovations with the cold attention of a military strategist studying enemy weaponry. He reverse-engineered every design choice, identified weaknesses, improved on anything Puma did well. Across the river, Rudolph was doing the same. The brothers had not spoken in over 20 years, would not acknowledge each other if they passed on the street, but their businesses spoke in constant dialogue. Every innovation by one was answered by the other within months. Sprint spikes, training shoes, football boots, tennis sneakers. The competition was so intense, so all-consuming, that it pushed both companies to heights neither would have reached alone. In 1970, Adi suffered his first heart attack. Minor, the doctors said. A warning. He was 70 years old and had never taken a vacation, never stopped working. The idea of rest was incomprehensible to him. Keita insisted he slow down. Horst suggested delegating responsibilities. Adi ignored them both. He returned to the factory within a week, walking the production floor with the same intensity, sitting at his study window with the same vigilance. But something had changed, not in his work ethic, but in the house's atmosphere. For the first time, mortality was present in the rooms, not as a distant abstraction, but as a practical concern. Who would run the empire when Adi could not? Horst was capable, but he was not his father. The other children had their own lives, their own interests. The Adidas empire was built around one man's obsessive vision. What happened when that vision closed its eyes for the last time? The town of Herzogenaurach had prospered from the brothers' rivalry. Employment was high, money circulated, but the social fabric remained torn. Families who had chosen Adidas in 1948 still refused to speak to families who had chosen Puma. The town's pubs were segregated by brand loyalty. Children inherited their parents' allegiances like genetic traits. The division was so complete that visitors found it absurd. Locals found it inescapable. In the Dassler residence, the question hung in the air during dinner, unspoken but undeniable. Can success survive when loyalty inside the home is broken? Adi had built an empire, but he had also built a silence. And silence, unlike factories or shoe designs, could not be passed to the next generation. It could only deepen. The distance between Adi and Rudolf was now measured not in kilometers, but in decades of refusal. Neither would bend. Neither would reach out. Pride had calcified into principle. The feud had become identity. And the house on the hill, with its clean lines and functional beauty, stood as monument to what could be achieved when ambition had no limits, and what was lost when family became collateral damage in the pursuit of victory. The 1970s brought changes that money could not solve. The market was shifting. American companies, Nike, Reebok, were entering the arena with aggressive marketing and celebrity endorsements that felt different from the athlete-focused approach Adi had pioneered. They sold lifestyle, not just performance. They understood that shoes could be fashion, not merely function. Adi saw this development with distrust, bordering on contempt. Shoes were not fashion. They were engineering problems requiring technical solutions. Horst saw it differently. He recognized that the game had changed. That brand identity mattered in ways his father refused to acknowledge. The tension between them intensified. Not in shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. The Dassler family did not operate that way. But in the study, during their morning meetings, the silences grew longer. Adi would reject marketing proposals without explanation. Horst would push back with sales data, market research, demographic analysis. Adi would listen, nod, then ignore everything, and return to his prototypes. The second heart attack came in 1973, more serious this time. Weeks of hospitalization. Katie sat beside his bed, reading him production reports, because Adi could not bear to be disconnected from the factory. The doctors were direct: rest or die. Adi chose a middle path. He would rest at home, but continue to oversee operations. The study became his world. He could no longer walk the factory floor daily, could no longer kneel beside athletes to check fit and function. But he could still design, still review, still maintain control. Horst assumed more operational authority by necessity, not by choice. Adi had not officially handed over leadership. He had simply become unable to execute it fully. The transition was messy, unclear. Decisions required Horst's implementation and Adi's approval, a dual structure that slowed everything. Competitors moved faster. Market share, for the first time in decades, began to slip. The house reflected this shift. Adi spent more hours in his study, less time at the factory. The shelves of prototypes became a museum of past victories rather than a laboratory of future innovations. He still worked. Drawings, modifications, endless refinements to existing designs. But the revolutionary breakthroughs had stopped coming. At 73, his mind remained sharp, but his body betrayed him with exhaustion, shortness of breath, the constant specter of another cardiac event. Kata had aged alongside him, though her decline was quieter. She no longer managed the household with military precision. The staff made decisions she would have once controlled. The gardens grew slightly wild. Small disorganizations crept in, mail left unsorted, rooms uncleaned for days. The house was not falling apart, but it was no longer maintained with the same obsessive order. The machinery was wearing down. Rudolf across the river was facing his own mortality. Puma had thrived through the 1960s, but the 1970s brought similar challenges. The American invasion, changing tastes, a market that no longer cared about the technical minutiae that obsessed the Dassler brothers. Rudolf's health was deteriorating as well. The two men, still refusing all contact, were dying in parallel, each aware of the other's decline through the gossip networks of Herzogenaurach. In 1974, Rudolf Dassler died. He was 76. The news reached Adi through Horst, who heard it from a factory worker, who heard it from a cousin. Not through official channels, not through family. Rudolf's death was announced in newspapers, in business journals. The obituaries detailed his achievements, his rivalry with Adi, the empire he had built. But between the brothers themselves, there had been no final conversation, no reconciliation. No acknowledgement that decades of silence might end before death made it permanent. Adi did not attend the funeral. There were those in Herzogenaurach who expected him to, who hoped that death might soften the feud. But Adi remained in his study, working on a new sprint spike design, as if nothing had happened. When Käthe asked if he wanted to send flowers, he said no. When Horst suggested a formal statement acknowledging Rudolf's contributions to the industry, Adi refused. The silence that had defined their relationship for 26 years would continue beyond the grave. But something shifted in the house after Rudolf's death. Not grief exactly. Adi did not mourn in any visible way, but a certain energy dissipated. The rivalry had been fuel. An engine that drove Adi even when his body weakened. Now that engine was missing half its combustion. Puma still existed. The competition continued. But without Rudolf on the other side, it felt different. Mechanical rather than personal. Adi's own health declined further. Another heart attack in 1977. This one nearly killed him. Months of recovery. The doctors said he had a year, maybe two, if he stopped working entirely. Adi calculated that stopping work would kill him faster than continuing, so he returned to his study. But the pace had slowed to a crawl. Hours spent staring at drawings, without making changes. Prototypes examined and set aside. The obsession remained, but the execution faltered. Horst had effectively taken control of Adidas by this point, though Adi refused to make it official. The company was evolving into something Adi barely recognized. Marketing campaigns with celebrities. Product lines designed for casual wear, not athletic performance. Revenue was growing, but the soul of the company, the technical purity that Adi had built everything around, was being diluted in service of market demands. The house had become a mausoleum of sorts. Adi rarely left his study. Käthe brought him meals on trays. The children visited dutifully, but briefly. The grandchildren were kept at a distance, shielded from the sight of their grandfather's decline. The prototypes gathering dust on the shelves were relics now. The window overlooking the factory showed an operation Adi no longer truly controlled. Can success survive when loyalty inside the home is broken? The question had haunted the house for 30 years. And now, as Adi's heart weakened and his empire shifted into hands that understood the world differently, the answer was becoming clear. Success could survive. The company would continue. The brand would grow. But what had been built, the singular vision, the obsessive perfection, could not be transferred. It could only end. Adi Dassler died on September 6, 1978. He was 78 years old. The end came in the residence, in the bedroom he had shared with Käthe for decades, overlooking the factory that had consumed his entire adult life. There was no dramatic final scene, no deathbed reconciliation with ghosts. He simply stopped breathing in the early morning hours, his heart finally surrendering after years of warnings it had delivered and he had ignored. The funeral was held in Herzogenaurach. Thousands attended. Workers, athletes, business partners, officials from across Germany and beyond. The procession moved through streets that had been divided by the Dassler feud for 3 decades. And in that moment, with Adi's casket being carried to the cemetery, the town experienced something it had not felt in a generation. unity in mourning. Not because the feud was forgotten, but because even those who had chosen Puma recognized that something irreplaceable had been lost. Horst Dassler assumed full control of Adidas immediately. There was no power struggle, no contested succession. The transition had been happening gradually for years, but official control brought new pressures. Horst was 48, energetic, visionary in ways his father had never been. He understood global markets, celebrity marketing, the infrastructure of sports beyond just the equipment. Under his leadership, Adidas would expand into apparel, accessories, sponsorships of entire leagues and federations. The company would become something larger and more commercial than Adi had ever intended. The residence, however, lost its purpose overnight. It had been designed as a command center, with Adi's study serving as the brain of the operation. Now it was simply a family home, occupied by Käthe and occasionally visited by children and grandchildren. The study remained largely untouched for months. Käthe could not bring herself to clear it out. The prototypes on the shelves, the technical drawings on the walls, the desk positioned at the window, all of it remained frozen, as if Adi might return at any moment. But the factory below had moved on. Horst operated from modern offices, with teams of managers and marketing specialists and designers who worked in departments rather than at a single man's desk. The three stripes were still there, still dominant, but they meant something different now. They were brand identity, not just Adi's signature. The company was professionalizing, corporatizing, becoming an entity that could survive and thrive independent of its founder's obsessive vision. In 1987, Horst Dassler died suddenly of heart failure. He was 51 years old. The same genetic weakness that had claimed Adi had manifested a generation later, killing Horst in his prime, at the height of his transformation of Adidas into a global sports marketing empire. The shock rippled through the company and the family. Horst's death was not just personal tragedy, it was a crisis of succession far more severe than Adi's had been, because Horst had not prepared anyone to replace him. The leadership vacuum created internal struggles, boardroom battles, eventually leading to the family losing control entirely. By 1990, the Dassler family had sold their majority stake in Adidas. Financial pressures, management disputes, and the complexity of running a global corporation without a clear successor forced a decision that would have been unthinkable in Adi's lifetime. The company that bore his name, that had been built through his obsessive perfectionism, was now owned by French investors. Later, it would pass to other hands. The three stripes would continue to appear on shoes and clothing worldwide, generating billions in revenue. But the Dassler family would no longer control their own creation. The residence in Herzogenaurach remained in family hands, but its relationship to the empire had been severed. Käthe lived there until her death in 1984. After that, it passed to the children, who used it occasionally but did not maintain it as Adi had. The study was eventually cleared, the prototypes distributed among family members or donated to museums. The house was renovated, modernized, stripped of the austere functionality that had defined it in Adi's era. Puma, meanwhile, continued under different ownership as well. The rivalry between the brands persisted, but it was corporate now, strategic, devoid of the personal hatred that had fueled it for decades. Marketing executives in different countries competed for market share, without knowing or caring about two brothers who had refused to speak for 26 years. The feud had become mythology, a story told to explain why Herzogenaurach had two sports companies instead of one. The town itself slowly healed. Younger generations married across the old divide. Pubs accepted customers regardless of which shoes they wore. The river that had separated Adidas territory from Puma territory became just a river again. But the older residents remembered. They remembered when choosing a brand meant choosing a family. when wearing the wrong shoes could get you refused service or ostracized from social circles. The physical scars of the feud had faded, but the memory remained, passed down as cautionary tale. The house where Adi had lived and worked stood as a monument to a very specific kind of ambition. Not the ambition to be wealthy, though wealth had come. Not the ambition to be famous, though fame had arrived. But the ambition to be right, to win, to prove every single day that his vision was superior to his brother's. That ambition had built an empire. It had also destroyed a family, divided a town, and ultimately consumed the man who had wielded it. The cost was calculable now, in hindsight. Decades without speaking to a brother, grandchildren who grew up as strangers. A life lived entirely in service of competition, with no space for reconciliation or rest. Success had survived the broken loyalty, but the men who had achieved it had not survived the cost of maintaining it. Today, the Dassler residence in Herzogenaurach stands privately owned, removed from public access and corporate tours. It is not a museum, not a historical landmark marked with plaques explaining what happened within its walls. It is simply a house where a family lived while building something larger than themselves and smaller than they hoped. The factory complex that Adi once overlooked from his study window has been transformed, repurposed, expanded beyond recognition. Adidas Global Headquarters operates from a modern campus on the edge of town, sleek glass and steel structures that bear no resemblance to the original workshop where two brothers once cut leather side by side. Puma's headquarters sit across the river, equally modern, equally impersonal. Both companies are now divisions of multinational portfolios, managed by executives who have never lived in Herzogenaurach, and likely never will. The Dassler name appears in corporate histories and branding materials. Museums in Germany display Adi's original prototypes, the shoes Jesse Owens wore in Berlin, the innovations that changed athletic footwear forever. But the family itself has largely receded from public view. The descendants of Adi and Rudolf live private lives, connected to the companies their grandfathers built, only through heritage and occasional ceremonial appearances. The fortune has been distributed, invested, moved beyond Germany's borders. The feud is historical fact, not living reality. What remains is the question that echoed through the residence for 3 decades, unanswered in Adi's lifetime, partially answered by his death and what followed. Can success survive when loyalty inside the home is broken? The brands survived. The innovations endured. The market share fluctuated, but never disappeared. Success, measured in revenue and global presence, not only survived, but flourished beyond anything the brothers could have imagined in 1948, when they stood in lawyers' offices, dividing assets and ending a partnership. But the men did not survive what they built. Both died estranged, having sacrificed family connection for competitive advantage. Both left behind empires that would outlast them, but also outgrow them, becoming entities that no longer needed the obsessive vision that had created them. The loyalty that broke inside the Dassler home never healed. It simply became irrelevant to the corporations that bore their names. The house in Herzogenaurach keeps its secrets now. Behind renovated walls and modern windows, the history of what was decided, what was refused, what was never spoken. The study where Adi spent his final years is no longer recognizable as his workspace. The view from the window still shows the factory in the distance, but it shows a different world than the one he watched so carefully for signs of his brother's movements. Silence, in the end, was the Dassler family's most enduring creation, more permanent than any shoe design, more powerful than any marketing campaign. A silence that began in 1948 and continues today, not from active refusal, but from absence. The voices that could have broken it are gone. What remains is architecture, corporate legacy, and the faint outline of two brothers who built empires close enough to see each other's lights at night, but too far apart to ever speak again. If this exploration of ambition and family resonated with you, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Which historic mansion should we examine next? What stories of power, legacy, and the price of success would you like to see uncovered? Thank you for spending this time in Herzogenaurach, where the walls between brothers became walls between worlds.